Okay, so I got a chance to see Warfare last night, which this is the newest film from Alex Garland, who is a director I absolutely love. He brought us the 28 Weeks Later franchise, which I think they're some of the best films of the decade and the century, especially 28 Days Later. Like, what a masterpiece, that film is, right? And then soon we have 28 Years Later, coming out later this year, which I'm really looking forward to. But then on the other hand, this is also the guy who brought us Civil War, 2 or 3 years ago. Which, a lot of people love that movie. A lot of people love that movie. I can see the appeal. But, that just wasn't a movie that particularly, appealed to me. Maybe if I go back and watch it, I will see all of the hype behind it. But yeah, that was just a movie that I kind of watched and it didn't live up to all of the statements, that I heard about it. So this was another war movie from Alex Garland. So I was like, I'm probably, not going to love this movie, but, I'm going to check it out, either way. Because, I am a fan of war movies. I think there's some great ones out there, We have Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk, which I think is, top five best, easily. You can argue with me on that all you want, but I think that is a great movie. And then we also have, Saving Private Ryan, and then we have, Band of Brothers, which is also great, So yeah, there's some great war movies out there. So, but these are also movies that I wouldn't, this is a genre that I wouldn't go back and rewatch. War movies I find take a lot of energy out of you emotionally, just because it's a genre that leaves you with a very particular feeling, like a feeling of anxiety and sadness, and it's a mix of different feelings for me, coming out of a war movie. So this isn't a genre that I would watch every day. So, now going into my thoughts on Warfare here. So this movie is about the Iraq War, and this film does something that I like to call guerrilla filmmaking, where it's very up and close and personal, and for the most part this film is based all in one location. Is we're following this team of soldiers, and where we're seeing the communication in this house, and and a lot of the shots are handheld, at least from what I could see in the film. A lot of the shots do seem to be handheld, which I do think, especially heading into the second act, going into the third act, does add a really great layer of intensity to the film, and actually makes you feel like you're a part of it. And then speaking of part of it, I'm setting up myself for a whole bunch of little cues here, is immersion. Immersion is such an important part of film, and Alex Garland absolutely nails that here. This film doesn't rely on music, but this film's sound design is magnificent. Like the sound design, alone, sucks you into this movie. And this is the type of movie that you could easily cover your eyes and just listen to the movie, and you would know exactly what's happening. Like, the sound in this movie is so suspenseful and terrifying and unsettling that that it hits all the marks that it wants to accomplish. So it's a good job to the Foley and sound mixing team on this film. And the acting here, by everyone. There's some pretty well-known actors in this film, and everybody does an exceptional job in this film. Everybody really sells their character, and this film does something that I really liked about Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk. I don't want to compare the two here, but where Nolan's Dunkirk is more kind of giving you a day of D-Day, of like what it's like to to kind of live in the moment of D-Day, and it's not so much about characters or story per se, is it's more about the experience. And this film kind of does a very similar thing here, where there is a story to it, but there's no characters, which I think I've always been appealed to war movies that that don't have characters, because I find they're the ones that have a lot of disbelief to them. And so that's one thing that I really do like in here. And this film isn't really action packed, so if you want to kind of go to a war movie expecting guns blazing and explosions, you're not going to get that in here, because this is a film that's definitely much more silent, and it requires audience patience, and and the scenes where where attacks and explosions do happen are very unexpected, and are are honestly quite terrifying, because there's no kind of cue to the audience that's coming. It just kind of happens, and it plays with the element of surprise, and and it does a really effective job at doing so. And the cinematography in the film, this is a really well shot film. There's a couple shots in this movie, two in particular I will happily take out and and put as a wallpaper. There were some gorgeous looking shots in this film. And the location, the location of the film is really good as well. I guess the family that is more of a side character to the film, they really sell the fear, because they're in a situation where they don't know what's going on the outside. They don't know the current progress. There's no updates. There's no communication. They're just kind of trapped in their house, and so they do a really good job at selling the emotions that are required of a role like that. Because I think taking on any movie, whether it's directing or acting or just playing any part in the production, I think this is such a hard this is such a hard film to take on board, because you're trying to reimagine something that you really don't know the feeling of how these soldiers kind of felt, and you're trying to reenact something, you're trying to, I guess, reenact an experience that that is kind of really hard to do. And I think another thing that I really like about this movie is this is a film that is made on a pretty small budget, and so the film does feel very contained, which I also think that's a big advantage for this movie, because when you watch war movies, it's it's usually big spectacle, and and I feel like this is a movie that really actually benefits from from a low budget, because I think it really keeps it confined, and I think it really I think it creates simplicity, and and it's very grounded in reality. Which, from what I know about this movie was shot entirely on location, which which was really good. And one more thing I do want to add here as well is is the blood and gore. But don't eat during this movie. Yeah, because there's some shit here that is pretty intense for the stomach, and it's really effective. It's really gross, and yeah, there's some shit in this movie, so don't eat. Yeah, Alex Garland, did such an exceptional job, directing this. This is only a 90-minute film, and and the film never once feels boring. A lot of people will say that the first 40 to 50 minutes of this movie is boring. It's not boring, and if it is boring, it's it's intentionally boring because there's this film is much more reliant on the suspense. I'd say that this is a much more suspense, driven film, and a lot more of a waiting movie. And it's a film, that never really pays off. It's not like you go through this slow experience and at the end, there's this big spectacle, action sequence. That's not what this film is. And this is produced by A24, and I would honestly be happy if A24, sticks to producing war movies. I think this very much suits their style quite well, and if they continue to kind of make these low budget, independent, war movies, I think they'll really hit the spot. And this is a movie that I wouldn't watch again, but wouldn't surprise me if this is on my top 10 best of the year. This is a film that really left me shocked and surprised and baffled in all the best ways possible. And saying I had a good time with the movie, is an understatement. But this is a really well-made, well-crafted, and well-executed, story and film, and it does everything that a war movie should. So, the film is in theaters at the moment, so please, go check it out. Go support this movie. This is a must see, and this is much more I guess, intact with what war is actually like from what I've kind of read, and I guess, and my knowledge of it, I could be 100% wrong, but from my own kind of, research on this is, this film is much more, I guess, faithful to the event. So, that's always good there. So anyways, guys, so that is my review for Warfare. So go check out the movie, watch it for yourself. Please go support this movie. And until next time, guys, I'll see you in the next video.